You're going to have to work together. You're going to have to realize that all your decisions impact everyone else. And I think we're missing that. But we are justifiably worried, and I think everyone should be, that how it's going to be done in the long term. Sometimes if the public really knows, it might make a difference. They care. It's an economic driver in our area, and you get the relationships that there's lots of good people that are down there working and doing a good job and trying their best to even doing the cleanest, best job they can, right? And get frustrated with the changes in management and how it's so hard to get the capital and this and that, or rules and regulations and that don't make any sense. This is very Canadian of us. It's like sometimes we try, but we shoot ourselves in the foot. When it comes to, they probably could do a better job environmentally if they could do the right thing without, getting too much bureaucracy involved. But they have to be educated too, and the studies have to be done and realize what we're learning. And obviously a lot of the environmental problems we had, we didn't really understand. And be it how we manage fish, or how we manage, water, or how we manage mining and manage energy. We don't really get it, and the public's got to buy in and care, right? And that's important. You do respect people's hard work and the efforts to make an economy and all those sort of factors, about being anti-business and anti-economy. But the more we learn, the more challenging it is, eh? When you bring up things that we just have to change our mindset and our model and not get into, let just profits be the only factor. You got to weigh these things out, and there is a way, right? You got to get buy-in from everybody, and you have to figure out the right sustainable levels, and I think that's the game. And like I say, our dream and hope for this mine is that, wouldn't it be great if it lasts for another 50 years at just the right scale, that they're, it's somewhat low footprint. They have a hydroelectric stuff, they could carefully mine at the right scale and maybe continue to learn how to put more stuff underground and deal with, the stuff they have as well as they can. Because that's what you like to see, is something that's going back, it's not, people complain about forestry, but at least forestry it's amazingly resilient. Erosion for road building is a problem, but the trees do grow back. Mining is a bit different issue if it's going to be a 10,000-year problem of, poor water quality or something. So those are some of the tough ones. At times their workforce goes up and down, and they've had big strikes and things. And a lot of it, in big business, they run with this sort of max profit model, and it's problematic. And they hope they wise up to this one of these days, because it's one of the problems is they get greedy because the price is good, and then they get away more employees, and then they shut the thing down and lock everyone out, or don't pay, or do this or that. So there's been acrimonious at times and sad, and you hate to see the miners all on strike, and then things go a little south and there's violence. And I remember there's a fuel truck crash, all to do with running a road blockage, and miners getting violent over stupid things and stupid stuff going on because people are mad and hungry and all sorts of things. So that's kind of sad. Quite often they end up in problems, and they bring it on themselves. Not like the laborers against upping their base of, oh, let's hire more people, that's great. Instead of saying, hold on, that doesn't sound sustainable to me. We're going to bring on 50% more workforce, but we're all going to lose our jobs in 5 years. Is that a good plan? And they, power to them, the mine people, we have a great relationship with the local guys in the mine for 60 years here. And, they're helping each other on the road for gas and accidents and fires, and, there's a good relationship, and they've always, they've changed ownership, but the guys actually working are often the same guys for their whole career, and I don't think we've ever had any worries in a good relationship with them. We did have a big fire here in '72 where we lost one of our big buildings, and certainly they responded and were the first ones here and did the best job putting things out those times. They certainly sent their whole fire crew and were very helpful. And just like we have been, I've responded unfortunately to a few too many car accidents over the years, and in different breakdowns of buses and all sorts of different things go on. They do know that they can come by Strathcona and use the phone and solve the problem or see what we can do. So I think that relationship goes on, that's important to us and things. And I think when we think of everything about the environmental sustainability, there's labor sustainability, there's social responsibility, all these things, we need a bottom line on all these areas. And that's my belief on good industry. If we need to start adding some of those things, right? As you hear the history of mining and all these sort of dealing with tailings and mine waste, that becomes where the problem is. It's probably the biggest thing is what do you do with it afterwards? How do you remediate it? How do you deal with all the disturbed ground and how that might, for a long term, be a problem? But there's lots of hard decisions, and you hope that there's consequences for people doing the wrong thing. There's stuff history down there. There was always a little history that I remember my father was mad in the 60s that they actually did convinced that the early days when they were sort of figuring out the mine layout that there was a big fire down there. And it was never, it was just accidental or who knows, but basically burned the whole valley bottom and the whole Selwood Valley burned and stuff, which is so, but the old days of mining they would quite often do just because it's an easy way to see the rock, right? You can't actually see in a heavy forest what the cover is. So, a massive impact. If you went and looked down there, right up to the top of Flower Ridge and all the way around the valley was burned in the Selwood burn. So, the thought at the time, no proof, of course, that there was no consequences, so there was a bit of a cowboy time to get things going. But, they've been trying their best and coming up with the best science of how they're going to actually remediate. They're putting more stuff underground, and they have a great big tailings waste paste plant. You'd have to get into the science if you're going to study it there, what they do, but they're trying to seal it all up, basically, so any waste doesn't actually ever get back into the environment. It's as simple as that, I think, and that's been a problem worldwide when you hear these great big dam failures at swamp areas. They've been trying to figure out how to do with all this stuff, right? Which is, I think, one of the biggest mine challenges. And as we know, the serious level of engineering in earthquake zones to figure out how to permanently seal something forever, we're just getting a handle on things around the world. And the engineering improves, and we hope, of course, that in this particular case for the mine, that they continue running very carefully like they're doing now and continue to come up with better engineering solutions. That they have the capital and the money to actually pay to do a good job of shutting it down and sealing it all up and entombing it and never having a long-term environmental issue for the watershed, which it really is a pretty pristine. If you've seen Strathcona Park, and it's a world-class environment with all the different flora and fauna that are very unusual and special and like around are very much part of this whole ecosystem. So the relationship for mining and the challenge thereof and how we're involved in that is, it's a good question, and we're hoping for the best, right? But we are justifiably worried, and I think everyone should be, that how it's going to be done in the long term. When you go and take people and look at these things, you try to explain them. How many nature walks that we've drove to a bus down there and go and look at the dichotomy of having the mine and the beautiful old growth timber and some of the really interesting botany in the area and some of the wildlife and the coming back of some of the management, and like the elk herd has gotten better because it's a park, obviously, in the long term. And I think people like the mine like it. Quite a lot of wildlife hangs out the mine because actually it messes people up hunting and everything else, and somehow it actually unintentionally they're doing stewardship of the wildlife and their deer and bear on the mine site, because people aren't showing up there and sneaking in the park and hunting, right? There's a whole ecosystem. We're all watching it when we go out there and bringing up things that concern us and bringing up to the right authority. So people are keeping an eye out, which is a good thing, and still doing the water samples and watching these things and seeing that they're doing a good job on actually all the things they need to do to keep on top of it, which does worry you for sure. Complicated. It even gets more complicated as we learn. Don't you find that there's the amount of stuff we learn and then we realize we don't know still. It all ties together. Oh, I've been to Strathcona Park Advisory Committee meetings but there's a couple groups, the Friends of Strathcona Park go, and there's people on the committee, and you know them a lot, of the people on the committee, and trying to bring up the right things. So you bring up, are they considering the recreational values of this? And like I say, and you try to find a way to, everyone has to play the lobbying game. But he does know a lot of the challenges, and I think it is important on their advisory committee to have someone actually can go down and ask the right questions to the environmental engineers and say, well, these are the big issues. And
I'd already had an interest in the park from the first time that we came here, of course, because of our connection with Strathcona Park Lodge. And so one of the things that I became interested in, I was interested in what was going on in the park, sort of local politics and development and what was happening with industry and various things. So I got involved with the Strathcona Park Public Advisory Committee. And I did that about a little over 10 years ago. And I've been involved with that since then. I think probably the thing that we really got going as a family initially was just all this park area and the background of the lodge, which runs does a lot of recreational things around the park. I guess I set my sights on a lot of the major hikes and getting our kids involved in doing hiking and climbing in the park. So that eventually kind of evolved into that kind of kept my interest in the park, and I eventually ended up getting on an advisory committee for BC Parks that I'm still involved in, and that's just around aspects of development in the park or whatever happens. They get advice from us. That's the SPACC connection. That's, again, it's sort of now become a little more of a Campbell River based type of organization. Well, SPACC started in the mid-90s, and it kind of evolved from the results of a commission's recommendations, studying the park and studying some protests that occurred in the I think it was the mid-90s, where there had suddenly been an allowance to permits had been granted to companies to do further exploration work deeper into the park than was already happening. So the Myra Valley was already being a site of mining activity, but then areas to the south of that, down Price Creek and up into the Bedwell area, that had mineral claims, and the government did a bunch of legislative changes that allowed the people to develop their mineral claims. So there was proposals to do more exploration work. There was a certain amount of exploration work going on, but when it looked like it was becoming more invasive or potential, and that there was more potential for developing more mining operations deeper into the park, people started protesting and blockading the road. And eventually became a bit of an impasse, but eventually the government realized they had to do something, so they started a commission. And the outcome of the commission was a report on the park and on the various aspects of what people were concerned about, and we now refer to it as the master plan. And part of the master plan was setting up an advisory council, or an advisory committee, which is now called SPACC, which is the Strathcona Park Public Advisory Committee. And the committee is made up of individuals who have strong interests in the park, but also who have usually some technical abilities in different aspects of things that are pertinent to the park. Myself, I'm a geologist, so the advice is being provided to BC Parks, because of course BC Parks, presumably some of the things that changed were because BC Parks wasn't receiving enough good advice from people that were independent of the government or independent of industry. And so this was set up as something that would help the furtherance of how the park was developed.
It's good they're doing a good job. And I've gone to meetings and said, well, what about this? And they figured this out. But you can't be an expert on these things for me to make a decision on what the best technique is. So I think my big picture stand back is I argue that don't give them a permission to expand. Say, relook at your numbers.
It's kind of, it doesn't have any of its own any clout. Like it's really just an advisory body. It could be, written off tomorrow if BC Parks decided they didn't want it. And recruitment for it is really through BC Parks. So BC Parks, people can be nominated, or they can put their name forward, and then BC Parks looks at the credentials and decides if that person would be somebody who could hear the issues and provide unbiased opinions on it. So it's not a special interest group, and we don't have special interest groups on SPACC. I've been the chair for the last few years, although but it's been a period when, because of the pandemic, things have really backed off. Plus, we've had a transition from one area supervisor who retired, and now a new area supervisor who just started at the beginning of the year and is still, becoming familiar with the park. So we haven't had a lot of involvement in the last few years. There hasn't been a lot of activity. I've been involved for about 10 years, and principally because of my geological experience. One of the activities, one of the things that SPACC is involved is, or some of the advice is actually reviewing what are called closure plans. Some people think that the mine's about to close because they've got a closure plan, but it's a requirement of all mining operations, or has gradually become more of a requirement, to have a long-term plan on how they're actually going to close the mining operations, so it's not just dumped and left with problems. So these are actually quite comprehensive plans, and they sort of go through cycles as the mine develops, or as it depletes its ore bodies, and as anticipated dates of actual closure come into play. And Myra Falls is, of course, famous because so many of these ore deposits are so deep and so hard. I mean, you really have no way of detecting them directly from the surface. They're literally, some of them are 1.5 to 2 kilometers down vertically below Phillips Ridge. So they're way down there. And so the development, why it's famous is because they keep replacing reserves. So they keep replacing, they find new ore deposits, they have, and the sort of the way that ore deposits are found and get transferred from something that is just a conjectural thing, or they've got a few drill holes through some, high-grade material, to something that's actually feasibly mineable. Is a fairly long-term process. They have to actually get close enough to the thing to be able to measure it, and then to do a feasibility study on whether it's actually mineable. So there's lots of ore bodies like that in the world, all over the place, that people spend decades measuring, drilling, evaluating, looking at market conditions, and then end up walking away from. And that's a little bit how the mineral industry works. The actual exploration activity is usually not terribly invasive. There's small areas that are disturbed, but generally not that big a deal. But then it becomes this dichotomy. It's sort of, are we going to face the possibility that somebody's going to build a mine in that area, or not? And so this is all part of what kind of activities are allowed in parks, and all through BC. Lots of parks, lots of different parks in BC. Some of them allow different types of mining activity, and some not. So the park itself is actually broken up into two major sectors: a Class A park, which is most of the park, and a Class B park, which is around the mine and encompasses the actual mineral claims. So that's something we deal with in SPACC, because we're looking at both parts of the park and the eventual kind of reintegration of that Class B park into the Class A park. The involvement of SPACC and the mine, it's I guess a lot of it is my involvement, because as I say, we do these reviews of the closure plans, and so I've actually been through a couple of cycles of these reviews now. There's often what are known as mine development review boards. So they have hearings with both the regulators, which are the Ministry of Mines, professionals within the Ministry of Mines, and then various biologists and park officials and that sort of thing, looking at different aspects of how they're going to actually close the thing, and what the long term, how it's going to be maintained in the long term, and whether there's enough money to do it, and so on. I think one of the last closure plans, they end up being quite technical, because there's you have a big stack of tailings that has to be maintained, and it has to be maintained in such a way that it's not polluting the lake, or that it's not susceptible to collapse or any of these things. And you have to have some kind of a vision about what the place is eventually going to look like, how you're going to, whether you're going to restore it, how you're going to restore it, and so on.